Hello, and welcome to a brief history of pitch in music. So, what's pitch? We might define it as how high or low a sound is, but then the question is, what do we mean by high and low? In physics, higher pitch translates to greater tension in a string, for instance. Thinner material, again, in a string, but it could be in something else, like a sheet of metal. Or shorter length, that's again with a string, but it could be the length of a tube that you would get with a flute, for instance. So those three things translate to higher pitch, whereas lower pitch translates to the opposite of these, which is lower tension, thicker material, longer length. So if you took a guitar string and you played the longest, the full length of it, it would be a lower sound. If you divide the string, if you make the string shorter, basically by putting your finger on it somewhere, you are making it higher in pitch. If you turn the tuning peg to make greater tension, the pitch is going to go up. Or if you bent the string, the pitch is going to go up. And then, if you reduce tension, it's going to go down. And then if you just compare the high E string of a guitar, say, with the low E string of a guitar, the high E string is a lot thinner. So the thickness of the string also matters and makes the pitch lower. So what all of that translates to is the rate of oscillation. And oscillation is something that you'd see like with a pendulum or like a swing, like a swing on the playground. It just means going back and forth, and it's really the same thing as vibration. But neurons in the brain are also said to oscillate, to go back and forth. So anytime you have a regular back and forth, you have periodicity, you have oscillation, otherwise known as, and that's pretty much the same as vibration. So what we were saying about higher pitch before with greater tension, thinner material, and shorter length, that translates to faster vibration. The greater the tension, the faster the string is going to vibrate. The thinner the material, the faster it's going to vibrate. The shorter the length, the faster it's going to vibrate. And then lower pitch translates to slower vibration. So if you lower the tension, the string or whatever it is going to vibrate slower, more slowly, I suppose. If the material is thicker, it's going to vibrate more slowly, just like with the low E string versus high E string. And then if the string has a longer length, it's going to vibrate more slowly. Now, we were talking on the previous page about pitch, what's high and what's low. Now, I'm going to just bring up a little bit of difference between what we call pitch and what we call frequency. We often treat those the same. And then timbre is something that we don't always associate with frequency, but based on how you define these terms, these things are sort of related. So it's good to get this out of the way. This is, again, sort of like a physics perspective, but it will help us in the long run to understand basic things that are related to pitch and things that are not. So the rate of vibration of an object is roughly equivalent to its pitch, but real objects in the real world vibrate in complex ways, with multiple modes of vibration simultaneously. Each individual vibration speed within a complexly vibrating object corresponds to its own frequency, since by definition, pretty much frequency just equals speed, like how frequent something is. There is a video that you are going to watch in this module by Andrew Huang, I believe. Really good video. I started watching some of his things on YouTube, and they're both like super cool and really smart. And he has one that's on the harmonic series, and so he's going to explain to you a little bit about how the pitch of the whole of a string can give rise to lots of different upper frequencies because of the different ways, the different modes that it vibrates at. So a full string vibrates at its full length, but it also vibrates at half its length, at a third of its length, etc., and that gives you different frequencies above the main pitch. Okay. So this doesn't have to make complete sense right now, but you'll watch that video also. And even if this never made complete sense to you, you'd still be fine in music class. But instead of just assuming that we all know what we're talking about when we say pitch, I, in this video, would really just like to go into it in more depth not because it's critical to get a job in music, but just because it does get you pretty interested in this, and it helps you realize, like, oh, there's a lot more to this notion of pitch than we tend to assume just by looking at notes on a page. Okay, for the second point here, the thing that we call pitch is the lowest of all the heard frequencies, i.e. it's the slowest and the strongest of all the object's many rates of vibration, and we call that its fundamental tone. So the lowest sound, if you strike a whole string, it's going to vibrate, like I said, in a half of it, half its length, a third of its length, a fourth of its length, etc. But when it vibrates at its full length, that sound produces the lowest frequency, and that sound is called the fundamental. And all the other upper frequencies are related to one another because they're all actually, they're all derived from the fundamental. We'll just say that. Okay, but in discussing this, you have to think about the difference between harmonic and inharmonic objects. For inharmonic objects, which just produce noises, the many different vibrations produced are pretty much unrelated to one another. So a snare drum is like this, even a bass drum. Bass drum sometimes has a tone to it, but the tone degrades quickly and it's mostly noise. Many of the percussion instruments produce inharmonic sounds. Even bells kind of produce some tones and frequencies that you can hear, but they're related to each other because bells are such weird objects that they distort the harmonic spectrum. So bells pretty much produce inharmonic sounds. For harmonic sounds, and other things in the world, like if you hear the wind blowing through the trees, that's definitely producing noise. If you hear a rock hitting another rock, it's a noise. If you hear wind blowing over a bottle and it produces a whoo sort of pitch, then that's kind of unusual. Most noises are inharmonic, but that's a case where you have the wind actually producing a harmonic sound. Okay, but harmonic sounds are also common in the real world. For harmonic sounds, for harmonic objects, the various rates of vibration correspond to one another mathematically as multiples of the fundamental. So you do not have to completely understand that right now. You probably understand it a little bit better by the time, over the next couple weeks. The basic idea is, like, you set an object in motion, like it could be a rock, it could be a string, it could be a flute. If all the upper frequencies that it's producing are related to one another, to the lowest frequency that it's producing, then that object is called a harmonic object. It's producing a harmonic series, and it usually sounds like a pitch. If, however, all the upper resonances, it's vibrating complexly, but it's like all the vibrations are not related to one another, just kind of random, then it's going to sound like noise, and that's an inharmonic object. So in music, we tend to use harmonic objects mostly, but like I said, we use snare drums, we use bass drums, we clap our hands, we stomp our feet. In language, we have vowels, and we phonate, and those things are harmonic sounds, but we also use consonants, which are noises, and those are inharmonic. So it's like we use both of these things. Okay, so, and then the last point on the page, the various upper frequencies heard above a fundamental pitch correspond to the sound's timbre. So I will demonstrate for you that in a minute, as if I do say so myself. Pretty cool demonstration. But the basic idea is that, let's say you take that string and set it into motion. If you heard just its fundamental, it would sound identical to any other instrument if you heard just that other instrument's fundamental at that same pitch. But since a violin string and a piano string and a guitar string and a flute and an oboe and a xylophone, those instruments, and a trumpet, instruments like that, even if they're playing notes that are all the same pitch, the fundamental frequency will be the same by definition because it's the same pitch. But all the upper resonances, like the pattern of upper resonances, is going to differ, and that's what we call timbre. And so those upper resonances are frequencies. So we pretty much reserve the term pitch for the fundamental tone, and when we talk about music, it's just the note that's on the page. And if you talk about it in your lessons, it's just like the note you're supposed to press on your instrument. I just wanted to point out that these things are all complexly related to one another. So a pitch is the lowest frequency, but all the upper frequencies are important and they come out. We just don't notate them. But those upper frequencies really produce the timbre, and the changes in that upper frequency spectrum over time produces the specific timbral sound. Well, so we now talked about what pitch is. Now the question is, why would you want to notate pitch? I think we all know this, that most people can go through their whole lives without ever having to notate pitch or feeling like, wow, I just wish I could write down what that pitch was or what this set of pitches is. Why would anyone want to do this or feel the need to do it? So, one idea is that it's useful as an aid to memory. So this helps you if you're a performer, you can have a bigger repertoire. If you're a composer, if you're trying to write a piece that's sort of bigger than your memory is, then writing it down helps. And if you're an improviser, you can structure your improvisations more fully by being able to notate pitch. And the other reason is for communication purposes, i.e. to allow someone else to learn the melody you just made by reading it rather than hearing it. So what I mean by that is that if you don't have a way of writing down notation, then the only way to learn a piece from someone else is by them singing it, performing it. But if you learn how to read music that's on paper, say, then you don't have to have someone else to teach it to you, and you don't have to memorize it by ear, right? The oral tradition. You can simply read the music. So writing things down, this is related to the above, but I'm thinking of it more in a cognitive way. Writing things down can aid in conceptualization, particularly for longer and more complex works. It's like what I talked about with composition, but it would also be for analysis purposes. So you don't have to just memorize which note comes after the next. If you're a performer, you can think about how the whole is put together, but it definitely helps to be able to have the whole written down from beginning to end, to be able to use your mind to sort of bounce around back and forth to different parts of the piece. But at the same time, writing things down can distort them by standardizing them and thus losing possibly important details. So let's just say a performer performs a note that's supposed to be a D, but it's just a little bit flat of D and then kind of bends up to the D. If you're writing it down, you probably won't even try to capture that, but it might be something that's really actually kind of important in how the song goes. So by writing things down, you discretize them, you make them discrete. You're losing the continuous properties. You're simplifying what's there. Sometimes we don't write down dynamics at all. Sometimes we don't write down exact durations. We write down proportional durations. Like this one is roughly half that of this other one. So everything that we're doing is sort of proportional, and we're fudging a little bit in terms of details. Every time you write something down, you sacrifice some details. So sometimes those details are not important, but sometimes they might be, and you might be missing things by not writing them down. Or you might be missing things by writing them down in a code that doesn't include the things that were actually important. Let's assume that you are sure that you want to notate pitch. So then the question is, how would you do it? We're going to create some axes here on a little chart. We're going to have pitch height from low to high, and then we're going to have time in that direction. And then note that we're leaving out some possibly important things like timbre and dynamics, like I talked about sort of on the previous page and even the page before that. So let's listen to an example. So you can see that what I've done here is I've taken that same pitch height and time diagram. I took a little representation of the music, which I'm going to play for you. And then, as you'll see on the next page, that this is going to roughly follow the contour that the voices are doing. And I just ran this through a program called Praat, P-R-A-A-T, that's used for speech analysis, but you can use it for music analysis too, at least melody. So this is bringing out which is the main melody line. And as you're going to see, like this is the pitch axis. So right around 200 hertz, 200 times per second, that's like I guess it's a low E in the middle of the bass clef staff, I believe. Yeah, D, G. D, right in the middle of the bass clef staff is what this is, at 200 hertz. So this thing, pitch height and then time. So we're seeing, this is a chart that's showing pitch height over time. So we're pretend this is just to help you understand what's going on, but pretend you don't see this. You're just listening to the sound, and then this is going to map it out. And this is the same thing. It's just there's a diagram in the back that's showing the sort of like intensity, pressure waveform. So give a listen. Okay, so what I did to get that is I took a Spotify recording of Populus Sion, which is just it's just an old chant that there's several versions of in manuscripts, so that's why I wanted to use this one. So I found a recording, ran it through this program Praat in Spotify, which plots this as pitch against time. And my question is, so pretend you're not looking at this musical notation. How is this as a representation of that melody. So ignore the score here and focus just on this. Does this seem to go up and down with pitch over time? I'll go ahead and play it again. Okay, so I would say the answer is yes, this is a good representation of pitch over time. There's some weird things like this drop. I don't know what that means. I think when they pause or something like that, and this sudden rise, I think that's kind of a glitch in the program, or it's just something that, anyway, ignore those two lines and that line there. So, but the other cases, the low note is not shown in the score, but I'll add it in a later one. But so low note rising up, down, down, up, right, kind of hanging on this note, and this note looks like it would be a D, so that is a C clef. I forgot to tell you how to read the clef, but you'll figure that out in a second. So this thing is the letter C, which is a C clef. So that line is C, above it is D, above that is E. That's a B. That line is an A, that's a G, and that is an F. And you can see this is only a 4-line staff. It's sort of an older way of writing things. Okay, so this is a good description of the sound that you hear. We're going to say pitch. But if I wasn't showing you this notation, would you be able to read this? Nah, the answer is no, you couldn't. You could just know it's like low, right? It's hard to figure out. You know whether it's going up or down, and roughly by how much, but you don't know the interval that it's going up or down. It makes a big difference if it's going up a semitone or a whole tone, right? A major third or a minor third, or a second or a third or a fourth. You can't read this. It's descriptive. It's describing the pitch contour of the tune, but it's not prescriptive. You can't look at it and then figure out the tune from it. And we're going to see that early notation is descriptive in this way, but you'd have to already know the tune to figure it out. Like, if you already knew this, let's say that's in my head, could I look at this and go, oh, that's Populus Sion? Probably, right? Because it's descriptive enough. I mean, that's the possibility. So that's what early notation was like. So we're going to see some more examples. Let's go to the next page. I just want to show you some more analyses. This is within that Praat program. What it's going to do, so it's taking this is the audio from Spotify, but I'm going to show you in there. Actually, I'll go ahead and play it. We'll first play just the audio. Okay, so we're looking at just that part. Sorry, we're going to do pitch first, which is spectrum. We're doing spectrum. This is, I told you all those other frequencies are present above it. So there's a lot of low stuff, and then there's some like upper resonances up here. This is whole frequency space, all the way up to 5,000 hertz. Now this is the pitch representation. So like in here, you see like the main pitch is there, but you have some upper frequencies in there. We're going to see those as formants. Okay, so that's just pitch by itself. Now we're going to look at intensity with a green line. It's cool to see that the phrase starts quiet, builds, and then goes down to quiet again, which is common for phrases. Now we're going to look at the formants. You don't have to know what these are, but this is upper resonances. Basically little pockets of air in the face that resonate. And now you can see how they align with these dark things over in the spectrogram above pitch. So as you're singing this pitch, you hear resonances here, not consciously. It's just to show you that pitch this stuff is affecting the timbre of the pitch. Okay, I know that's a lot of stuff. You don't need to understand that. This is just to make it interesting for you. Now, I have another video for you, again, for fun. This is just a different way of analyzing music. This is within the program Logic. And here it's going to show you it's going to show you frequency response in real time. So let's watch it. So first it's just, I'm not filtering anything, it's just normal, but we're going to see and hear. So you can see that 200 hertz frequency range. You can see above it, there's a 400 hertz. So every time you have 200, you have 400, 600, 800. Okay, so that's what normal sound looks like. Like written on the page, we're just writing pitches, but you're actually hearing these higher frequencies. Now what I'm going to do is I'm going to mute the upper frequencies as much as possible. So you can see up there, this is 10,000 hertz, 20,000 hertz. This is the highest we can hear, but we don't hear pitches up there. In here we hear pitch. Down here is where men sing. So I'm gonna try to mute everything as much as possible above 200 hertz. So and we can listen to that now, where you're hearing mostly just the fundamental and just a tiny, tiny, tiny bit of upper resonance, but mostly just the fundamental. You can see down here, these guys are much lower than they were before. They were bouncing up here before, but we muted them, so they're much quieter. We're hearing mostly in here, mostly fundamentals. Now, what I'm going to do is, I'm just going to sharpen the muting of everything except the fundamentals. So if the fundamentals are around 200 hertz, I'm now adding an extra filter in there to just try to mute. See, we're getting just the stuff in here now, mostly. This is all muted, so we're mostly hearing just the fundamental. And then this time I'm going to boost even more, roughly where the fundamental are, and then we're going to see how this low range is really going up higher above the line now, right? It's definitely made louder. But interestingly, you can't hear the words, you can't hear the vowels. You can just hear notes, but not the exact, you can't hear the vowels because you're not hearing the spectrum, not hearing the timbre, really, the upper frequencies. So now if I introduce more of the upper spectrum, sort of getting rid of that guy. I'm going to get rid of this other filter. Now you can hear the different vowels. So you're hearing more of the timbre because you've got the upper frequencies. Now I'm going to take out the lower frequencies. I'm going to take out the fundamental and you'll hear just the upper frequencies. So interestingly, those pitches that we're hearing now, we'd say they still have the same pitch, even though I've taken out the lowest sounds. But we're really just able to guess kind of what the lowest pitch is, what the actual pitch generating this stuff is by the timbre of the upper frequencies. Last time. This is when you just have a very, very narrow band. You can hear it kind of whistling at specific pitches. Okay, so going back here, we're looking at just the beginning. Populus Sion. So I don't know why this note is not in the original, but they sing instead. This looks like do-dum, but on the recording they're singing no-dum, so they're putting this note higher. This is D. They're singing this as an F. D, F, D. Zion. That's what's happening there. And that's how it relates to that pitch contour line. Now, here, finally, we get to a really early notation. So this is the earliest notation of this chant, I believe. I mean, this is from a source that's one of the earliest notated sources of all. So this is around 900 CE, which is Common Era. It's the same as AD, right? We just don't say AD anymore. We say CE for Common Era. And instead of BC, we say BCE, which is before the Common Era. Okay, so around 900 AD, right? Middle Ages. This is when pitch starts to get written down, but at first it's just written down like this. Now, you had to look at Neumes a little bit for the last assignment, but this is just getting you more into them. So this is easier to read, but this happens much later. This is what it first looks like. So it's hard, like this is hard to figure out what's going on, but it looks like maybe that, right? That's just kind of a guess. You'd have to really know this tune to know what these little symbols mean. So when I was talking about prescriptive and descriptive before, these symbols are descriptive. If you already knew the tune, this might help you remember it, but they're not prescriptive. You can't just look at this and know what it is. In the same way that this line is sort of descriptive, but not prescriptive. So go listen one more time. This is the earliest notation of this. I'm going to do it one more time. Okay. So, and this is from another manuscript around the same time. Might be a little later. Actually, I don't really know if it's later or earlier, but it's probably later. But again, you have almost the same thing. It's very hard to figure out what they would be meaning if we didn't have the music or know the tune already. But that's my guess as to what that means. We can listen again. Okay, and you can see that this is sort of, these sketches up there are sort of a way of notating this, right? And then I just want to point out this term, oops, it's not U-heightened, it's supposed to be unheightened, but these are neumes, but they're not higher or lower in space depending on where the pitch is. They're just showing the contours. It's like still pretty hard to read. Okay, this is another version, but check this out. It's really cool. So this says it's very hard to read, but that says D, F, A, C. So this F is important because there's a red line there, and that red line is the same as this line here. So the early scores, this staff has 1, 2, 3, 4 lines on it. This staff only has one line, and the stuff we saw on the previous screen didn't have any lines, right? So it's the neumes are now here heightened. Their relative height is shown, and there's one note that's given. The F is given, and then these other ones are penciled in. So that's kind of interesting. That doesn't usually happen, but you can see there's a C up here, so just like a C here. And later on this is around 1000 Common Era, you ultimately get a line for the C note as well, and that's going to be this guy. So in the same way that C clef says like, hey, that line is C, that makes, and this line is F, that makes this G. This is C, so D, D, E, or F, the way they're singing it on the recording. D, 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 E, D, C, and then back to D again. You can see that here it's just above the F line, so that's a G. Going up to, it looks like it's going up to C. We know from this later version it really should be going up to D, so it's just not super exact. Up to above, that looks like that's that E or F up there. And then back down again. So this stuff really does look like it's in on the C, especially because that B means B flat, and that means it's going C, B flat, C. So this might be just like a slightly different interpretation of this melody. But it's the same tune. We can listen to it again. Here's one more version. I know this is super blurry, and I kept in the red and the green line. They're not there in the original, but there's now 4 lines of staff. So 1, 2, 3, and 4. And then... So you have almost exactly this. And this is around 1200. I'm pretty much guessing on these dates based on... This one could actually be a lot later, but you start to get notation like this around 1200. Okay, and you can see I'm calling this heightened, sorry, quote is supposed to be there, but diastematic neumes. Don't worry about the word diastematic, but I mean, that is a term that's used, but the point is that they're on a staff. I don't even know what the word diastematic means, so I apologize. But they're heightened and they're actually on staff lines, so a 4-line staff. So this is the first time that you could actually go and read this. Like we wouldn't, this is the first time that the notation is prescriptive. I wouldn't have to know the melody before this to be able to look at this and sing it. I could just find, someone could give me an F or a C, and then I could go D, D, E, or maybe that's F, but we'll see it's E. D, 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 E, D, C, D, D, right? I can do it, I can read just from the notation. So this is an important point in history where notation becomes not just descriptive of something that you learned by the oral tradition, but something it's prescriptive in that you could read it for the first time. Okay, and then here's what it looks like in modern notation. You can see in modern notation, there's a 5-line staff. I'm still using the C clef, so this thing is a C clef, and this is movable. So right now it's in tenor clef version, so that C note is, that C line is there. So there's a G, that's G down there. This C is there, so D, D, F, D, 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 E, D, C, right? That same line, D. That's how you read the tenor clef, and you can see that's exactly what's going on here. There, we just kind of like added a line down here because this one's a 4-line staff, this is 5 lines. This will sound exactly the same if you write it this way. So now I've got alto clef. It's still a C clef. C is still right in the middle of the clef. There's that C line. So this is still G, D, D, F, D. Right? It's just everything is kind of shifted down a bit. So that's why I say that this clef is movable. I'm going to show you, go back for a second. So like there, it's on the 2nd line from the top. Here, the clef is on the middle line, third line from the top. Okay, but that will sound identical. Like there's not going to be an octave change or anything like that. It's identical. Because the C clef always refers to middle C. Now we have the bass clef. What is the bass clef? The bass clef is the F clef. So in the same way that I said there was a red line before down here, I should have drawn this in. Maybe I did. Nope, I didn't. But imagine there's like a red line in here that shows you F. So it's exactly the same melody, just the G right above that F. This is the D right above middle C, just like this is middle C here. Right? So these are all the same notes. This is just written in bass clef. And then I'll show you the same thing written in treble clef. So that's middle C right there. So this is G below middle C, going up to the D, which is right above middle C. Right? So it's the same thing here, but now we're using this clef. Why is this called, well, you know why it's called the treble clef. Why is it called the G clef? It's called the G clef because look, it circles around this note G. So this clef used to be movable too. So let me go up to the bass clef again. The bass clef centers around the note F. Imagine like a little red line there, and those 2 dots are around the note F, and this clef actually circles around an F note. with this one, this treble clef just circles around the note G. So it's sometimes called the G clef. So I showed you this screen in the last video, but I kind of needed to show it to you early because you were going to do homework on it. But we're going to just go ahead and do it quickly again. So neumes are what existed before there were notes. Originally, there were just little dots, lines, and squiggles, only roughly approximating where in pitch space a note was. So when you heard that, when I told you that in the last video, you're probably like, I don't know what you're talking about. But now you kind of do know what I'm talking about because you just saw those squiggles and we tried to read them and we tried to make sense of them. And we also saw how over time, yeah, they're going to become a little bit more easy to read. But at first you would have these kinds of squiggles, and I asked you to guess what those meant. And that means a lower note going up to a higher note. So lower note, higher note, higher note, right? Not super obvious. Lower note, higher note. This one, the clavius or flexa. This one is going to be higher note going down to lower note. As you can see, higher note going down to lower note. And these are just several different versions of each one. And then this last one, climacus, is 3 notes going down, upper note, middle note, lower note, right? Upper, middle, lower. And these do mostly look the same. So eventually, these notation things, the neume things, become a little bit more precise. So we saw at first they weren't even heightened. They weren't showing relative pitch space. They were just showing, you know, when a note goes up, or I guess when it goes down, all within a single syllable. So, and this was the 10th century, so 900 to about 1000 ACE. And then the next century, 1000 to 1100. Actually, if we include the whole century, so 1000 to 1300 or so. So now you can see, if you just compare these things in France, like this stuff 100 or 200 years later is becoming a lot more, it's got these little dots that show you where the notes are. So a little bit easier to read. These are going to be the same things, but so if you're going up with a note going up, you get dot, dot connected to it right above it. If you've got a note going down, you have dot, dot, and these are connected in a diagonal. And then if you have 3 notes going down, you have a note and then 2 diamonds. Whereas in some traditions, they don't have the little stem on there. They just have the diamonds. So, and then we already did this in the last video, but you can compare the earlier and later versions of the pes. So the pes, right, like that line, like a little thing in a line, and that eventually becomes a thing in a line, but there's a dot at the top too. The clivis, notes going down, eventually was this little squiggle that looks like that, and then they end up putting like a note up there and a note down there, so you get a note up there and a note down there. And then the climacus, 3 notes going down. Originally you have a slash and then 2 dots, and then eventually you get sort of a note at the top of that slash and then the 2 dots, and they're all more diamond or square shaped. So this is a little bit of background on what this all means. So the term neume comes from the ancient Greek, and they don't really know whether it came from the word to breathe or the word breath from pneuma. You know, we still use that, like if you get pneumonia, or the word sign pneuma. So anyway, I assume it has to do with breath, but who knows? So up until around 900, when people started writing down pitch, music was just transmitted via oral tradition. So when I asked you on one of those earlier slides, like, why would you even want to write down pitch, and that a lot of people go through their lives not needing to write down pitch? Well, it seems like a lot of people went through their lives not needing to write down pitch until about the 9th century. And then I was just looking at sources of early notation in other cultures when I was just doing some reading over the weekend. In China, in Iraq and Iran, there are some other places too. I can't remember which ones they are, but a lot of different cultures started writing down pitches at the same time, interestingly. So it's one of these things where it seems like several times independently, but all kind of at the same time in the world, people were figuring out ways to write down pitch. So it's almost like the zeitgeist of the time. But up until that time, everything was oral. Monks learned the entire repertoire of chant by ear from a young age. And as the church grew, right, from these like little tiny local parishes to something that was like took over all of Europe and was imperial and took over parts of North Africa and elsewhere, as the church grew, it found that there was problematic inconsistency in how chant tunes were sung across different parishes. Like one quote from someone I was reading is that each local rite had its own liturgy and its own music. So in around mid to late 700s, you get the Carolingian Renaissance. Like that's from Charlemagne. The word Carolingian is related to Charlemagne. Charlemagne was he was the son of Pepin. Charlemagne and his father Pepin sought to rein in this creative freedom, requiring all local parishes to perform chant according to the official authoritative version. This is the way that they were trying to secure power within the Catholic Church. And so for Pepin and Charlemagne, who were living in France, to sort of like be able to rule over the entire kingdom. Like if everybody was doing their own thing, they wouldn't be able to control the whole empire. So there's this cool, famous story when at around 750 or 753 CE, the French court, which is where Charlemagne eventually ruled, but Pippin was ruling at the time, invited the Roman monks, and those guys were the authoritative singers at the time, invited them to travel to France and teach their singers how to properly do the chant in the right way. So, and the French and the Germans are, I think, kind of the same people at this time. I might be wrong about that. There's like the Gauls and the Franks, but the Franks are actually the Germans. It's very confusing. But anyway, I'm just calling them the French Germans. The French Germans then began writing down these melodies. Now, they memorized them, and they only really started to write them down like 100 years later. Sort of like with the Bible, right? Like, even though you have, like Jesus said some things in 0, or like a couple years before 0 of the Common Era. But the people that wrote the Bible didn't really write down those stories and those quotes until about, I think, like 100 years later. I mean, I'm not a biblical scholar, but there's something like that. So it is pretty interesting. But the court of Charlemagne learned the stuff from the Romans, and then they started writing them down. But they're all writing them down in different ways. So they're writing them down to the best of their abilities, but they have all gone back to their individual communities, and they're doing this in different ways. And who knows if they're doing it accurately or not, because they're trying to figure out how to write pitch notation, right? So the Romans, they were the ones that were the authoritative singers, right? The French and Germans are just writing down what the Romans were doing. But the Romans didn't end up writing down their own versions of their songs until about 300 years later. And by the time they did, the songs that they were singing they didn't really resemble what the French had written down centuries before. So the fascinating question is whether the French wrote down inaccurately what the Romans had been singing, because the later Roman song is much more intricate. So the question is, did the Romans, when the French were writing down what the Romans were doing, were they writing down like a simple version of what the Romans were doing? Or is it rather the case that the Roman chant continued to evolve over over 300 years, basically, between the first time it was written down and the next? So if you think about the French writing down accurately what the Romans did in 750, then 300 years later, when the Romans write down their own chant, maybe in both cases it's being written down accurately, but that chant has become much more decorated. So that's one of these very cool, interesting questions about the history of Western music and the history of notation. It gets at this question of, how accurate is notation compared to what people are doing? And then there's also this interesting thing that notation sort of like freezes things in time. So it's like anything that Beethoven wrote on paper cannot be mutated anymore. If Beethoven's music was only passed down by oral tradition, it could change in each generation. Every time it gets repeated, it might change based on who's repeating it. And so it would evolve over time, like a folk story, folktale. But once you start writing things down, you always have an authoritative source, so you start going back to that. So you can also think of the earlier French, which is Gregorian chant, the German Frankish chant of 750. That's Gregorian chant, whereas Roman chant it's the same tunes, but they're just so much more decorated. And writing it down, the French may have been super accurate at the time, but as a result, they didn't do that much improvisation or development of the tunes because they kept using the originals. And yeah, anyway, fascinating concept, at least for me. So a very brief overview of the different periods that I kind of mentioned a little bit, but from about 600 to 1000 in the Common Era, people were writing down, there were books created, but they just had the text, just the words of tunes. Then around 800, all the way up to 1200, you would see those neumes that we saw early on for Populus Sion. Just the neumes, but not heightened. So you can't tell where in pitch space the thing is supposed to be. You just kind of know the general contour. And so before the year 800, there's no representation of pitch at all, not even the descriptive kind. It's just, oh yeah, even before that. So before that, you don't even get any neumes at all. Then from 1000 to about 1200, right? So it's overlapping with what's going on here, just because there's a bunch of different overlapping traditions. Then you start getting the neumes heightened. Before 1000, no one has written down music in such a way that you could read it if you'd never heard it before. But this is around the time that you start getting, this is around the time that you start getting the lines on the staff that are green and red and green for F and C. But actually, I get that in a different bullet point. But I just want to point out that you also around this time are getting digraphic notation. So let's say you have an instrument and the notes are labeled A, B, C, D, E, etc. Sometimes what they'll do is they won't have a staff at all, but they'll have the little neumes, and then they'll have letters below it that say A and B and C. So that's called digraphic, because you've got the neumes, and then you've got letters, but the neumes are still not heightened, I think, at this point. Then you start getting those one-line staves where it's the F is in red, or the C is in green, or you might have both. You could have the two-line staves indicating both the notes C and F. And then around 1200 and later, definitely going into the beginning of the Renaissance, you get four-line staves or even five-line staves. So I think by about 1500, which is middle Renaissance, the five-line staff becomes pretty common. Okay, and then just some pictures. So this is Populus Sion, again, but just a little bit bigger. You can see like those are a bunch of squiggly neumes. They're not really heightened. Maybe these are a little bit higher, showing up in pitch, but there's no way that you could read this without knowing the tune already. But it also is pretty interesting, and there looks like some letters there. So I don't know if those are notes or if they mean something else. This, as you can see, has a reddish line, so we can assume that that line is an F. So these are notes above F. That's a neume. Something like that. That's a neume going up from the F to above it. This still would be kind of hard to read if you don't know this tune, but if you knew it, the having that F line in there really helps you out. Why would F and C be the lines that you would put on your staff, like in colors? Those are the most important, because assuming it's just there's no accidentals, then both F and C have semitones right below them. So by showing where the F is and showing where the C is, you're showing where the semitones are. We'll talk about that a little bit more a little later. Here's another picture showing, as you can see, the green and the red, and there's the additional lines in there too, but the red, that says that it's an F. I think maybe that line is red. It's hard to see now that I pay attention to it. But that line, that says F, and that line is red. That's F, so that's probably C. I would guess that all these other lines are C's, so that must be a C also. In any case, I don't know exactly how to read this, but you can see that the author is specifying which is the F, and probably also which is the C. Some more neumes. This is from the 12th to the 13th century, and here you just have some heightened neumes, right? And then there's one line. So that line is either F or C, and it's hard to tell what that, if that says, I think maybe that says C. Let's assume it says C. So basically that's a C clef, right? That little C there and that line ends up being our clef. That's how you read. It's just telling us how to read the notes. Okay, so this is around 12th, 13th century in Germany. Here's also Germany, 12th and 13th century, so around the same time, just a different part of Germany. And you can see the neumes are actually different. Let me go back. So these are very squiggly, sort of like the ones we saw before with Populus Sion. These are much more, I don't know, jagged almost. You can see there's a really thick line and a thin line, so that might be F and C or vice versa. But so there's definitely lines there again. You can see here you have more lines. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. Let's check out what's happening. Looks like there's stuff happening. Yeah, both. This is looking like this would start to get easier to read. Like it would still be hard. Yeah, I think it's still impossible to read this unless you know the tune. This you can come close to almost reading it even if you don't know the tune. And here, even though it doesn't look like what we see today on paper, we could probably read this pretty well. That says C, that says F. I mean, I think. So it's hard to say, is that no, C, that's F? Actually, I don't really know exactly. So, but if we could figure that out, we could definitely read this. So this starts to be prescriptive, not just descriptive. And this is the 15th century, so 1400s. And this is, again, German, right? So all these different traditions are going on in different parts of Germany. This is in Hungary at the same time period, the 1400s, 15th century. There's a C, that's an F. So this is really pretty clear. We could do this one. So I'm going to call that C up there, A, G. So G, A, C, 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 D, C, 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 A, B, C, A, C, A, C, C, B, C, G, A, C. Right, so we could read that one. That's the first prescriptive notation that we've seen, fully prescriptive. I think we can read that. And that was like, so Hungary, 15th century. Okay, so this is Prague, Czech Republic, late 15th century, around the same time period. And that's a C, so that's an A, that's an F, that's a D. D, E, F, E, D, G, G, F, E, D, C, D, E, F, E, D. Right, so we can read that one too. We don't know anything about the durations of these things. That comes later. But now with these staves, they're just 4 lines, but that's fine. And then with the clefs, we can read this stuff just from never having heard it before. And that happens over the course of, look, what we were talking about at first is 9th century. So like from 800 AD or 800 CE all the way up to late 15th century, which is all the way up to 1499, right? 1500. That's 700 years. So over the course of 700 years, the ability to develop to prescribe pitch notation that people could read it without having heard the piece. It takes 700 years to do that. So when you look at notes today, what I'm hoping is that you're like, oh, those things are cool. They have a history. And they probably say something about our minds. And they say something about like how much you need to write down pitch or not. Right? For whatever reason, before 800 AD, people didn't really need to write down pitch, presumably. Okay, so final screen. I just wanted to give you a quote. This is from Ian Bent and some others who are writing in the New Grove Dictionary of Music and Musicians, which is great. You guys get access to it on the library website. Anytime I look up something, I often actually do go to Wikipedia first, but then if you want a very good and long dictionary entry on it, encyclopedia entry, go to the New Grove Dictionary of Music and Musicians. This is from it's like a 170-page article on notation. So here's what Ian Bent says. Broadly speaking, there are 2 motivations behind the use of notation: the need for a memory aid and the need to communicate. As a memory aid, it enables the performer to encompass a far greater repertory than he or she could otherwise retain and realize. It may assist the performer's memory in music that is already basically known, but not necessarily remembered perfectly. It may provide a framework for improvisation, or it may enable the reading of music at sight. This last concept is a predominantly Western one. A written notation provides the means to sketch and draft musical ideas during the composing process. So, also as a means of communication, it preserves music over a long period, facilitates performance by those not in contact with the composer. It equips the conductor with a set of spatial symbols by which to obtain certain responses during performance. It presents music as a text for study and analysis, and it offers the student the means of bringing the piece to life in his or her mind when no performance is possible. And it serves the theorist as a medium by which to demonstrate musical or acoustical laws. Okay, hope you enjoyed this presentation. Yeah, I hope it inspired you to think about pitch and appreciate sort of like pitch as the writing down of pitch and scales and staves and staves and clefs as complex things. And then in a couple weeks, we'll do the same thing by looking at the evolution of rhythmic notation. For now, just get to work on drilling all the kinds of things we do with pitch, like scales, intervals, etc., and that will help you internalize all this knowledge. Okay, thanks, and have a great rest of your day.